I'm trying to get 60 years in an hour, and this is very, very definitely not a moan from an old man about the old days. It might be a moan from an old man, but not necessarily the old days. So my early years, I was brought up on a farm in West Sussex, small farm on West Sussex. There it is, and that was my bedroom for the first 28 years of my life. And the whole house, despite the thumping great chimney, was unheated, so I can tell you what frost flowers were. There was no road there, and you had to go over 2 fields in 2 directions to get to the house. No electricity, no telephone. We had an outside toilet, and until about 1985, I suppose, we had a well, and then it was condemned. So I know a little bit about being at sort of ground level. I've always been fairly close to nature and the land, of course, being born and brought up in the country, and it was an isolated farm anyway. My first biology lesson at secondary school was on honeybees. So, of course, I was 11 years old, and I remembered that for a long time. And then, at the age of 15, I was helping a next-door farmer with haymaking, bale cart and that sort of thing. And I spotted some bees that were coming out from bramble bushes. Couldn't see the hives apart from just sort of peering through. So I inquired who they were, and I was told they were the farmer's son, but he hadn't touched them for 10 years, which was pretty obvious. And the very short story is that I called in the teacher who taught me 4 years earlier, and asked him how much I should offer. And he said, well, a WBC with bees offer £10. So I offered £3 and then got the confirmation that I could have them. And by the way, there's two empty hives in the barn. So I ended up with 3 WBC hives and had a colony for £3. I have spent a lot of time beekeeping, and I've treated it really as a privilege. It's something that not a lot of people do, but I've really enjoyed my time in beekeeping, and in fact 61 years that I told you about. What it has done is taken me through, not through me pushing, but it has taken me through doors that I really never expected to come across. Almost immediately I joined the West Green Beekeeping Association because the teacher that taught me happened to be the Assistant Secretary of the local Beekeeping Association. So I got caught out. And then I had a stroke of luck. The secretary was a man called George Wakeford, who you'll just about see him online now, but most of it's the stuff that I've put on there. And there he is, and that's absolutely typical of many of the beekeepers that were in my area 60 odd years ago. He was the secretary, but quite frankly not secretary material at all, to the point where they went 7 years without having a committee meeting. But he was a tremendous character. He himself was born and brought up on a farm, and there wasn't too much he couldn't turn his hand to. And what his job was, or main job, was looking after around about 400 colonies for about 100 customers. And a lot of his work was summer work, just responding to swarms. If there wasn't any swarms, the bees just got left, and that was it. So it was almost let alone beekeeping. Supers on in the spring. If he got called out for a swarm, he'd go and sort it out. If he didn't, supers off in August and extract the honey, as indeed a lot of beekeeping was in them days. I've written about him on the Whisper Green website, so if you want to have a look there, just have a look, and there is a PDF together with that same photograph. He was the best handler of bees I've ever seen by a very, very long way. There are some people now that think they're good handlers of bees. They're absolutely nothing to what this guy was. He didn't know much about what was going inside the colony, but because he was a a country chap used to animals and that sort of thing. He could work things out. He knew perhaps visually things, but he certainly didn't know, let's say, how foul brood spread or anything like that. He never ever wore any protection, none at all. That's him handling a colony of bees, and that's very much how I remember him. Now, I spent an awful lot of time with him, being a teenager, evenings, weekends, school holidays, and that sort of thing, and I learnt a huge amount. Coming from the country, people like us, we tend to learn by watching people and copying and that sort of thing. If I asked him a question, it was sort of, well, that's how it is, boy, and that was about it. And he really didn't know, but he couldn't half handle bees. So my early years, I actually put 24 colonies into my second winter. I can't remember how many came out, but I certainly lost some of them anyway. I spent all my working life as an engineer, tool making, press tool making mainly, and there was, as an apprentice, there was a little money. I think my first weekly wage was £2.10, so it wasn't very much. So consequently, any equipment I acquired was old, the sort of stuff that other people were chucking out, and being useful in my hands, I repaired it, perhaps made new bits and all sorts of things like that. I subsequently had several different hive types, but that's, if somebody offered me something, I'd take it, whatever it was. But they're all on British standard frames, no Langstroth or Dayton. Because I built up quite quickly, I got known locally, and at those times in my area there were about 20 small commercial orchards, and I say fairly small. Most of them seemed to be run by ex-military people who'd probably bought a small farm or something like that after the war, and found out that our conditions were very, very similar to that in Kent, and there were about 20 orchards, and I did pollination for them, and it varied between about 4 colonies up to probably about 20, something like that. And at one stage I ran about 130 colonies for about 15 years, as well as having a full-time job, young family, playing cricket 2 games a week, that sort of thing. Most of them were of WBC type, which of course were cumbersome. So what I did for pollination was to make special floors, which are a bit like the national floor, only obviously a bit smaller. And those 2 hives there, I think you can see some celandines in the background. So that is spring. Those have actually come to the winter. So people say that you must mollycoddle bees and have insulation and all the rest of it. They are just WBC brood chambers, brood boxes. I did sell quite a bit of honey locally, and that I think is how I got known a bit as a beekeeper, which is why the orchardists asked me to do the pollination. I was elected to the Woodford Green Committee at the age of 18, and I became chairman at the age of 23, which there must have been younger ones, but I sort of got forced into the position because the previous chairman died in office after doing 24 years. I did 26 years, so the Woodford Green Association in the first 50 years of its existence had two chairmen. Now, beekeepers will always vary. Doesn't matter where they come from, even if they're next door neighbours taught by the same person, they will always vary. And for different reasons too. In my association, when I first started, about 50% worked on the land in some way. So there were practical people. I forget, early 1960s, most of them would have come through, or all of them would have come through World War II. and they were still into the sort of make, do and mend mentality. And very few people bought anything. They tended to make it or use something else, improvise from something else. Money was short because being farm workers and that sort of thing, they were on low incomes. And people had larger families in them days. It was quite common for people to have 4, 6, 8 or even 10 in a family. And beekeepers were working long hours, probably 6, sometimes 6.5 days a week. Most of them lived in tied cottages, and very often there were 3 generations in the same house. And it could well be that the oldest generation might even have been born there, and the rest of them just carried on the same farm. But what they did have was usually large vegetable gardens, and in there they may well have had livestock, things like chickens, ducks, geese, some even had pigs. Now, one of the changes from today is that many of them had anywhere between 10 and 50 colonies. And what they were doing was selling the honey at the garden gate, really to augment their income. That's really what they were doing. And it worked, families I think were very much closer then than they are now. But it was done on let alone beekeeping, because there weren't the problems that there are now. Of course, they didn't have time. Come home after 6 o'clock or 6:30, something like that. Get climbed over by 4 or 5 children, go out and do 2 hours in a vegetable garden or mow the lawn or something of that nature, and there simply wasn't much time for bees. Many of the hives and the equipment were what one might term ramshackle, very old. I've certainly seen and been involved with hives that were probably made in the 1920s. People tended to keep things 50, 60 years or more in those days. Very few people had cars, and even less had telephones. So getting around was actually quite difficult. And I remember on many occasions attending meetings, and I used to cycle. A lot of people came by push bike. There was one family that had a motorbike, and they had 4 children, all within 6 years. So Dad rode a motorbike, Mum rode pillion, and the 4 children crammed in the sidecar. And they used to turn up to beekeeping meetings, and everybody sort of enjoyed themselves. But of course, being on farms, people had milking to do, perhaps haymaking, harvesting, feeding animals, get back, feed the pigs at 5 o'clock or whatever. So people were coming and going all the time, even if indeed they were there at all. But a lot of these people, a little bit like George Wakeford, didn't know very much about what was happening inside the hive. But because of their background, they had quite a bit of gumption, and if there was an issue, they could generally work it out, because it doesn't really matter what stock you've got, whether it's chickens, pigs, sheep or bees, the basic principles are the same. So coming on to modern beekeepers, which may or may not be you folk, few work on the land in any way. How many of you folk do? Work on the land in some way? Nobody. 50, 60 years ago, half of you would. Many start, nothing wrong with that. I'm not being critical or anything like that, it's just how things change. Many start beekeeping these days after retiring, possibly early, any time after 50, whereas in my day, when I started, quite a lot of them were second, perhaps even third generation, or they started like me early on. So these days, a modern beekeeper hasn't got anywhere near as long in the craft as the older beekeepers had. Okay, they've got much more learning opportunities than the older beekeepers had. Most of you people have got a much more formal education than the older beekeepers had that just went to the local village school or whatever. You're certainly more wealthy, and you probably learn in different ways. You probably expect some sort of course with some sort of assessment and a qualification at the end of it. That obviously never used to be the case. Mainly, I think, because of work culture, expectations are now much higher than they used to be. People tend to be, I think, less practical, and they would rather buy things than make or repair. You can see all the gadgets and things downstairs, which we wouldn't have seen 50, 60 years ago. Sometimes I wonder how people find a use for some of them, but that's another thing. And what I'm finding, because I've been teaching now for 50 years, what I'm finding is, in the old days, people used to try to find out why a colony got into the state that it's in, so they can next time they can work their way out of it. Now what I'm finding, especially with emails and things like that, is that people just want an answer, and they don't necessarily. There's a couple of nodding heads there. They don't seem to want to find out why the colony's got in that position. They just want an instant answer, and that's it. That may be disrespectful to you folk, but that's in fact what I'm finding. And I think probably because of emails, I don't get involved in social media, but I understand there's quite a lot of that sort of activity on social media. Probably if something is seen in print or it's online, it's very often taken as reliable when it may not be. And people these days, I think, keep bees for different reasons. They used to keep bees because they either needed the honey for the family food or they need it for income. Now people keep bees for those reasons, but other things have crept in, such as I want to help the bees, or they're just interested in the bees themselves, not necessarily the honey. I'm not criticising anything at all. All I'm saying is that things have changed, and I think beekeeping needs to accommodate those changes rather than just sit back and moan or dismiss people, as unfortunately I do see. There's quite a lot of intolerance in beekeeping. You can see quite a lot of that online too. When I say impractical, this is a roof outer that somebody who has got a very high-powered job made. At my association, even under instruction, you could see what's happened. Organisations, BBKA, used to be run by a secretary and a chairman, and that's it. The secretary was on our area, and the chairman was just did their 3-year stint or whatever, and helped out and advised and poked them in the right direction, that sort of thing. And there was a paid office with a permanent staff and a permanent headquarters as well. So that's one change. We've now got the BBKA News, which must be 30 odd years old. Yes, because Sharon Blake was editor for 30 years. So yeah, must be knocking on for 35 years. The original one was a single sheet, and from memory it was foolscap, if indeed any of you folk are old enough to know what foolscap is, or was rather. The BBKA now have a spring convention, which was devised by a man called George Knights, and he called it a GDO. What's GDO mean? It was a great day out, and George was a bit of a sort of bit of a boisterous man who would encourage people to go to something like that, and that's been successful ever since. National Honey Show, this event here. When I started, was in beekeeping, it was in Caxton Hall in Westminster, and the total area was less than this room here, and it was mainly exhibits. There was probably 3 or 4 times the amount of exhibits that there are now, and there were really just 3 main stands, and then there were smaller ones as well, and the 3 were the main suppliers at the time, which was Lee's, Thorns and Taylor's, and of course Thorns is the only one out of those that are still in existence. County and local beekeeping associations have changed quite a bit. I'll give you a little bit of a clue in a slide or two. They are very, very variable. I get around the country quite a bit and see various ones. Some are incredibly good. Others, let's say, they've got a little bit of ground to make up. But they are now, where everybody used to be scrabbling for a little bit of money, they are now fairly cash rich, I think. I don't think there's a problem if someone wants to spend £5,000. I don't think there's a problem anywhere. Grants, of course, have come in. Not everywhere, of course, but all sorts of things come in. Grant sponsorship, perhaps I should have put in there. Far more of them are charities now than used to be. Either a charity or, well, a CIO, doesn't really matter. That the CIO, of course, does protect the officers from litigation. Bee disease insurance, of which I'm currently vice president, was actually started in 1936 and still doing exactly the same as it was set up for. But now, as you heard earlier, they sponsor research and events, usually related to disease, pests, pathogens. That's always them. So they're still doing quite good work. But of course, they're all suffering from the modern diseases that anybody who's involved with anything it suffers from. Rules and regulations, risk assessments, fraud, health and safety, political correctness, all those sort of things. And I have to say, it probably makes things much more difficult for people that are organising things. So my sort of involvement, I first went on the Whisper Green Committee in 1966. I have been chairman of West Sussex, I think, 4 times. No, chairman 5 times and president 6 times. BDI vice president, which I told you about. BBKO trustee, I did a full term there, and that was mainly good, but I came in right at the time where there was all the backlash from the support, let's say, of pesticides. I'm afraid I was in the group that had to try and clear the mess up. Unfortunately, I lost a very good friendship over that, and somebody who hasn't spoken to me since. I couldn't get it through to them that, sorry, but a contract's been signed. There's absolutely no way we can break a contract. But anyway, that's it did cause problems at the time. I'm currently beekeeper president. I've been teaching and demonstrating since 1962, and one of the most enjoyable things that I've been involved with is being the manager or apiary manager of the teaching apiary for Whisper Green, which I've been doing for about 20 years. I thoroughly enjoy doing that, seeing new people coming in, helping them, and then in many cases seeing them teach others. It's a really enjoyable experience. 5 books I mentioned. I'm involved in quite a lot of videos and live at the Hive, which I guess most of you know about. There's a downstairs on the bibber stand. They've got it running down there. I thoroughly enjoy doing that. And for those who don't know, it's just me being live streamed from handling bees at the bottom of my garden, and absolutely nothing set up for the camera. I just go down there in in normal kit. Okay, yes, we got to wait for 5 o'clock or whenever it is we start. So there's nothing false about it at all. I organised the lectures for Central Association for about 5 years, I suppose, and I'm still organising lectures here. And I've travelled widely, not only in the UK but abroad as well, where I've seen a lot of different beekeepers keeping a lot of different kinds of bees in a lot of different kinds of conditions. And that really has brought home to me that the standard method of teaching, which I call teaching by numbers or robotic beekeeping or whatever you like, isn't really suitable, because it's just written or spoken to suit the person's locality, rather than for everybody. And that's what I try to do in my lectures, is to try and make it applicable to everybody. In doing so, I've met an awful lot of interesting people. I've met some really great people here today that have probably just been names to me. Yeah, over the last 3 days, I mean, not just today. Some changes, well, obviously communication. We used to have plain postcards. Anybody remember plain postcards? Yeah, of course you do, yeah. Of course, mobile phones are coming. What about fax machines then? They came in and gone out in that time. Transport, of course, is now an awful lot easier than it used to be. The internet, I think, has made more impact than anything else, because if you are careful where you get your information from, there is actually underneath the twaddle, there is some good advice and information. And of course you can order things online, you can pay for them, all sorts of things. You can delay the delivery or get it delivered next door if you're going shopping or whatever. You can do these things so much easier. Decimalisation, metrication's come in my day. Well, what does that mean to beekeeping? Well, weights and measures. In the old days, we used to only be allowed to sell honey in 1 ounce, 2 ounce, 4 ounce, 8 ounce, or pound, or multiple of pounds. That's all you could sell the honey in. So if you wanted to sell 1.5 pounds, you couldn't do it because it was illegal. Now, of course, you can sell honey in 128.384 grams if you want to. Well, that's right or not wrong, I don't know. I'm not arguing one way or the other. All I'm saying is that it's a change. Health and safety, of course, with risk assessments, notices, those sort of things. So perhaps at a local association, you need signs up. Protection too. When I started keeping bees, probably 25% of beekeepers didn't wear any protection at all, no veil or anything like that. I've never worn a bee suit in my life, it's pretty well known, or a tunic. I've only ever worn a sort of ring veil, and I haven't worn gloves for years. Now most people get what I call fully booted and suited, and it's only a personal thing, but I think they're probably divorced from the bees and they don't always spot the mood of the bees. Regulations are coming. Food safety, sell-by dates and batch numbers, and also, of course, treatments. So if you treat your bees, you've got to record, and well, you've got the regulations in the first place, what you can and can't treat with, and then you've got to record and then keep the records for 5 years. Work culture I've mentioned, and teaching and learning. We used to have, or many counties rather, had beekeeping instructors, county beekeeping instructors. They were called CBIs. Some felt that they weren't instructors, they were advisors, so they called themselves advisors. Doesn't really matter. They were generally allied to the agricultural schools and colleges. I can't remember one that didn't have a teaching apiary. Certainly in West Sussex we had 2, and West Sussex is a fairly small county. We certainly had 2, one at one of the schools and one at the agricultural school. And what they had was facilities, so perhaps like a science lab or something like that. So of course they had microscopes and, you know, lecture facilities, all sorts of things like that. You know, they were basically piggybacking on something else. There's our county beekeeping instructor, Harry Thompson. We used to have a summer school, weekend summer school. It was usually in June every year, and he brought the hives in, and then did either him or visiting lecturers did demonstrations. I think they provided very, very good service, but of course, with all the cuts in the posts many county beekeeping instructors, they were first in line to go. Some were a lot kinder than others. Some waited for the instructor to retire. Others found them more and more to do outside beekeeping, so they were doing all sorts of things. Ours in West Sussex was a supply teacher as well. So what happened when they disappeared? Well, somebody had to do the teaching. And of course it was left to the beekeeping associations, and of course they were not particularly well equipped to do so, and they were, as they are now, very, very variable. And of course what happened is that all the county beekeeping instructors were interviewed for the job, and there was a qualification, or still is a qualification, the NDB. So of course that gave the county councils, the employers, an idea of the quality of them. So I can't remember a bad one, and I've been involved with quite a lot of them, either gone to their lectures or whatever. But of course we'd gone very, very quickly from professionals doing the teaching to amateurs in local beekeeping associations, and that was a little bit difficult, because some of them were, as I say, incredibly good, and others might have got pushed into it and didn't really want to do it anyway. The BBKA exams are now modular. They never used to be. Online information is very, very variable. I've got unreliable there because I think a lot of it is, and perhaps inappropriate as well, because it's so easy, especially for a beginner, to go online and find something that, video that's perhaps done in California or Florida or Kentucky or whatever. Is going to be very, very different than the UK. But of course, if you're a beginner, you don't always know that. The NBU, they have got some very good material, but don't forget they are concentrating on diseases. Some of the other stuff is actually quite useful, and of course the Bibber website, which has now got a lot of videos and information on. So this is a personal view on teaching and learning, and I'll stress that it is personal. We had a rapid influx of beginners around about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, certainly early century, and I think the membership of BBKA went up from 8,000 to 24,000 in about 3 years. It was a massive increase. That did cause issues, especially for local associations, because what we ended up with was a great imbalance. If you've got a sort of a stable situation, you've got as many new people coming in as you've got dropping off, and then all the stages in between. All of a sudden, we had a massive number of newer beekeepers who didn't know obviously anything at all, and of course there were fewer people to teach them. So the experience and the skill levels were way out of balance. Now the beekeeping associations responded in different ways. The more progressive ones actually took advantage of the situation, adapted or modified what they were doing, perhaps put on courses, and in general some of them did very well out of it, and it was just a little more than a hiccup. But there were some very negative ones. Some simply closed the doors to new members and just rejected them. Sorry, but go away. It's strange that a year or two later they were complaining and whinging and whining because of all these beekeepers starting up and not joining an association. It did happen, and that was it. Partly as a result, I think, some teaching has changed. there are now quite a lot of beekeeping associations I come across who just teach the first year only, and that is it. If you want to know any more, you go and read a book or watch a video or something like that. Others take, as we do at Whisper Green, we take everybody right from even before they start keeping bees as far as they want to go. You know, people have got different ways of doing things. Consequently, you end up in many cases with beginners teaching beginners, perhaps up to BBKA basic level, and then that's it. And if you're in the second or third year or whatever, you tend to get abandoned, which you know, you can argue is good or bad. I'm not here to do that. I'll just tell you what's happened. But what did happen was that because all the old beekeepers said, I can't handle it, there's a great slot of knowledge and skill that's been lost. And it's going to take an awful lot of time and effort to bring it back to what it was. It's only a personal view, I know, but I think the overall knowledge and skill levels overall throughout the country are actually quite low. Interesting, I speak to people in other countries and it's the same there as well. So it's really a worldwide problem, I think. Of course, it got aggravated by COVID because many associations just effectively closed down for a couple of years or so. I mean, they had to. We couldn't have meetings. Zoom helped a bit, but then what it did was overexposed a lot of speakers, and quite a lot of them said, I'm sorry, I'm not doing it anymore. That's where we are. Teaching apiaries, they used to be run mainly by the county, as I've already mentioned, but of course many then closed. If you haven't got a county bee instructor to manage it, what do? Some went to volunteers and kept them going for a little while. In fact, I did the one for West Sussex, and I had an agreement with the principal of the agricultural college that I can do what I like, take whatever honey I want, but at the same time I had to pay for the feeding and all sorts of things like that, which lasted for about 5 years, I suppose, until he retired. In came his successor. I went there one February and there was a pile of ash with what was obviously beehives, and he just asked for the lot to be burnt. We don't want anything to do with bees, and that got burnt. This is by contrast. This is a photograph I took in 2013 in Switzerland, Landcourt Agricultural College. And you see those beehives there at the front. There's 8 there, I think. There were 28 altogether. And that, what looks like a shed there, was actually a bee house and a classroom. And looking round on the right-hand side, there's other bees inside. So I don't know what there was, probably 40, 50 colonies of bees altogether for instruction. Looking inside, that was it. The gent on the right-hand side was the assistant tutor. That was really well set up. It'd be nice if we could have the same in this country, but it's got to be funded somehow. There are now far more teaching apiaries than there used to be. There always used to be teaching apiaries going right back, but not very many of them. At Whisper Green, as was started in 1966, and it's taught many hundreds of beekeepers. I'm really proud of it. Personally, I think the teaching apiary, if it's used well, is a brilliant resource, to the point where I've written a book about it. I'm not here to sell books, but it's available downstairs if indeed you're interested. I think one of the best ways of learning is getting your head stuck in a beehive, observing what's happening, and with a bit of lateral thinking, you can work out what's going to happen in the colony in the next 2, 3, 7 days or whatever. They are very variable. There are some that are really excellent, quite good, but there are others that are quite poor, and for various reasons too. Sometimes it could be that the person that's been running it for X number of years has decided that they're going to give up, or perhaps politics, or perhaps the size of the area, the sort of site itself, perhaps there's no car parking, all sorts of things like that. Some of them that I'm invited to do a brilliant job with very, very difficult conditions. So they are run in different ways, but at the end of the day, you can only do what you can with what you've got. If they're run to their full potential, you've got the opportunity to teach existing beekeepers and also those that are thinking about it as well. You can also do things like open days for the public. You take children. We've had at Whisper Green, we've had scouts. We should have had scouts this year, but unfortunately something got in the way. You do open days, all sorts of things like that, so you can publicise beekeeping. Some of them, as I've already mentioned, just do the first year only, and that's it. They're the only ones allowed in the teaching apiary, and then after that, it's all abilities. You can have visiting demonstrators, if indeed you want visiting demonstrators, or you can work with the bee inspectors. Now, on several occasions, we've had bee health days, which are absolutely brilliant. If you get the opportunity, then please take it. Because if you've got a teaching apiary, they can take people out into the apiary and show people how to do an inspection for disease. You can do lots of other specific things too, like queen rearing, perhaps honey extraction demonstrations. You can even run the BBK basic. We used to do it for about 8 or 10 years, I suppose, for West Sussex. It's looking as if we might do it again. It makes it nice and easy. You just get everybody together and it cuts down on the assessor's time. You can have a shop. Ours is basic. So we sell frames and foundation and spacers and that sort of thing. So not a great shop, but I have seen one in particular that was literally like an agent, and I think 4 people ran it, but I'm not sure. Some of them have got classrooms. I very often go and do demonstrations on allotments. Associations, they've got sites on allotments, and of course they've got the meeting room for the allotment holders, and they might hold 20, 30 people. Great. So I'll show you a few examples now. This is our old apiary at Whisper Green. We've now moved, but that's how we set ours up, so you can get all the way around the hives. And incidentally, going backwards, look at all the honey on that lot, supers on that lot. You can actually turn it into an income source as well if you want to. You can have small groups. That's the same apiary. This one was on an allotment. It wasn't a particularly big area. It was probably about half the size of this hall, I suppose, but there were probably 15 or 20 hives in there, and you can do a lot of teaching in a place like that. This one is the other way around. That's very small, right up in the corner of a field look. I don't know why it was like that, none of my business. I think there are 8 hives in there, full hives, 6 or 8. You could probably only get half a dozen people in there at any one time, but you could probably get people outside the netting to show. They did okay, that's fine. And this one here, in really is an urban area in Essex, I think that was completely surrounded by houses, apart from this little oasis right in the middle, with 20 odd hives in there. So hives and equipment, my early days, mainly WBC and what were called cottage hives, which I'll show you a bit in a minute. But I had different hives, different types of them. Both WBC and cottage were 10 frame hives. Some of the WBCs were the old-fashioned straight-sided lifts, and they were different sizes depending on who made them. And it seemed to be a trick of the old manufacturers that if they made something half an inch bigger that wouldn't fit somebody else, they'd have to get, the beekeeper would have to buy off them. But the brood boxes and the supers were the same. Cottage hives were the same capacity, 10 frames, and they had single walls. Although they had their own supers, most people used WBC supers, but there was a reversible lift, which I hope to show you in a minute. So this is my early apiary, probably about 1966. You can just see the house at the back there, and in those few hives there, what do we got? We got a fairly modern telescopic WBC hive there. We got 2 cottage hives there, and you'll see that they got WBC supers on the top. One's got a bit of corrugated iron on the roof, but that's how we kept our bees. Providing it hadn't got any holes in and you had a brick or something to weigh it down, you were okay. This one is unknown, the only one I've ever seen. I wish I'd kept it now because it's probably of historical interest. It's probably now 100 years old. That was a WBC type, but although it was machine made, there was no indication who made it at all. Some of the old WBCs, instead of being square like they are now, were oblong. And one of the makers who made them was a company called Overton at Crawley in Sussex. It ceased trading when their land was taken over by Crawley Newtown in the late 1950s. And there on the same hive is a pre-telescopic WBC that I found that fitted. Now when I'm talking about pre-telescopic WBC, they were straight-sided with plinths round. So you can see how it worked. These are cottage hives. The one on the left is obviously an old one. And that's the reversible lift that I told you about. And the one on the right is quite interesting because Thorns introduced that as their centenary hive, which was a copy of the first hive that Thorns made 100 years earlier. So it is a cottage hive. They were basically to the same design, but depending on who made them, the final design was different. Now, the green arrow goes to the super that was that normally went with it, but as I said, most people used WBC supers. You've all got crown boards, I suspect, but when I started, many people had a canvas quilt, which was a thick piece of canvas, cut to the size of the top of the box, and of course that would go straight down on the frames. They were absolutely brilliant for hiding wax moth. We used to have straight-nosed smokers as well, not the bent nose that we got now. And there's one there. And I gave that one up at only about 6 or 8 years ago when it just fell to bits. People used to moan about these, saying, "Oh, they keep burning out." I've had these going for 2 hours on one charge. But people didn't fold the cardboard up tight enough. That was the key. They just wrapped it up loosely, and of course it lasted 10 minutes, and that was it. I used to reckon that these smokers were really good. Some didn't use smoker at all. They either used cigarette smoke or pipe smoke, and of course a lot of people smoked in those days. People couldn't perhaps afford a hive tool, so they'd use a screwdriver. And the old-fashioned queen excluders you had the option of either short slot or long slot. Short slot are the size that you get now. Long slot was about twice as long. And what used to happen was that one slot will be up like that, another one next to it down like that, and the queen would get through sideways. Very common. We don't get queens up in supers anywhere near as much as we used to do. We used to get queen excluders in a roll, great big roll, not the cut up ones now. And I always thought, why on earth are they doing that? And then I think I discovered the answer. Because there's a Scottish hive that was popular probably up until about 1960, called a Glen hive, which is effectively a telescopic WBC, but instead of being 11 frames, I think it's got 15. So it's longer, the brood chamber's that length. And of course, you bought your queen excluder in a roll, and I think you cut it off to soup. And I think that's where it came from. These are the only Glen hives I've seen in use, and that was in Orkney, 15 years ago, I think. Treatments. When I started keeping bees, people were paranoid about acarin and nosema. I don't think there was any need generally, but they got paranoid. And we used to have 2 treatments for acarin. One was called Fro mixture, which I'm sure you've heard about, and the other was Folbex. Neither of those are available now. And then nosema, there was only one treatment for it, which was a product called fumagillin. Fumagil B was a trade name. Oxalic acid, of course, came in and went out. We could only use it as a hive cleanser. We couldn't use it as a treatment for Varroa because it wasn't registered. Now, of course, you've got the proprietary oxalic acids that we are allowed to use. PDB, paradichlorobenzene, which is a wax moth repellent. That was used by everybody. Now we're not allowed to use it at all. And of course, creosote for treating hives. We shouldn't be using creosote anymore. So all sort of treatments, they're the sort of things that have changed. Now Varroa spread across Europe. It took 20 odd years before it arrived here. And what worries me about the tropilelaps that Dan spoke about earlier is that if that comes across, then I think the best chance of it coming into the country are on imported bees. So I discourage people from using imported bees if I can. Anyway, it took 20 odd years to get here. In 1978, my local county association, West Sussex Beekeepers Association, put a resolution to the annual delegate meeting. Owing to the high incidence of disease coming in with imported bees and the proliferation of Varroa jacobsonii, note the name, Varroa jacobsonii, and it spread across Europe, we proposed that the BBKA should seek a ban on all imported bees. Well, would you believe we actually got the ban, which I think we had for about 5 years. Now, I suspect, but I don't know, that because the ban was put in place because of Varroa, once Varroa got here, there was no need for the ban. So then that ban, unfortunately, got lifted. Varroa was detected in Devon in 1992, and it spread rapidly, gone through the country very, very quickly. Many beekeepers gave up. And like everybody else, I can't see Varroa on my bees. I haven't got Varroa. But I take the attitude that many beekeepers can't even see the queen, and the queen's an awful lot bigger than Varroa is. So probably an eyesight problem. Anyway, it got shifted. They discovered several hundred colonies within weeks, I think, from memory. The early treatments were synthetic pyrethroids, and they lasted for around about 10 years before we started to get resistant mites. We were told that we all had to change to open mesh floors, which subsequently a lot of people are changing back to, because I don't think there's a benefit anywhere near the benefit that was made out to be. And we were told of various IPM methods, integrated pest management methods. And then some bright spark came up with the idea that everybody should treat for Varroa at the same time, and the glorious 12th was suggested. Well, that's okay, but didn't take into account the people that aren't going to do it, and also the free-living colonies. We then tended to go to softer treatments, things like thymol and oxalic acid. Then the name got changed to Varroa destructor, and we now know that, thanks to the work of Samuel Ramsey in the States, that Varroa actually feed on the fat body tissue of the bee. Varroa, in my opinion, changed beekeeping forever. And if there are any areas still without it, I recommend very strongly that they try to keep bees out. Equipment. Much has changed, often for fashionable reasons too, not necessarily for the bees. Many parts used to be British made by the manufacturers, suppliers rather. Now there's quite a lot imported, and the quality is quite variable. You can get some really good, especially extracting equipment, really good, top-notch, well-made, but other stuff can be, let's say, a bit on the flimsy side. Protection, I've briefly mentioned. There's me on the right-hand side there with Martin, one of our members, on the left. That's how I've always handled bees. Never ever worn a bee suit in my life. I tried to get me in one on one occasion to do a video, but I declined. Now that is much different than what we get now. But that round veil I've got, I don't think you can get them anymore, but there's a picture that was taken probably in the mid-1960s, and you can see the person at the front has got exactly the same veil as I have. And the one at the back, these was like sort of folding, like a box, and they folded up, and a lot of people had them as well. Bee suits were first introduced by sheriffs in 1969, and now of course everyone gets fully booted and suited. I'm not arguing one way or t'other, I'm just saying that what the changes were. Many amateur beekeepers used to use a small tangential extractor, sometimes as just a 2 frame, anything probably up to 6 frames. This is a 6 frame. This is mine, and on one occasion, 1 year rather, I extracted 2.5 tonnes of honey in 2 weeks in that extractor. But now there's a 9 frame motorised radial, and that's the sort of thing that a lot of amateur beekeepers with just a few hives use. Well, to me it's almost like a status symbol than a piece of kit that's used. And then we had to change the material that equipment was made from. So instead of tin plate and galvanised and those sort of things, they had to be stainless steel or food grade plastic. You can see the honey tanks on the left and the bucket on the right. We used to have 28-pound honey tins, lever lid tins, a bit like the coffee tins. Seconds have come in, and I think they're absolutely brilliant for the ordinary beekeeper. But when I started keeping bees, even though it was early 60s, you just never saw a knot in anything. Never saw a knot. But of course they were western red cedar that was cut from large mature trees in Canada. I find them very good. They're less than half price. The wood is grown in Britain. It is cedar. It's still western red cedar, Thuja plicata, but it comes from sustainable forests. So you get smaller trees, hence the knots, which are no problem at all in my view. They last a long time. I started using them when I took over the teaching apiary at Whisper Green, and we still got some as sound as the day we used them. they'll probably last 60, 80, might even be 100 years. And as I said, I think they're brilliant, brilliant value. This is the old style National. Sorry I didn't clean it up, but it's the only slide I could find in a hurry. The internal is exactly the same. The ones that we use now that we call National used to be called Modified National. It's just a different method of construction. The outside dimensions are still exactly the same. There's one of my hives, and it was just it wasn't set up for the camera, but all of those boxes are probably 60, may even be 70 years old. It's just stuff that I've acquired over the years, as you can see, you know, different colours and all the rest of it. Still very good. The frames that we get now are different than the ones we used to have. We used to have what we call split top bars, and they were half the thickness, and there's a saw cut all the way through, and you just opened it out to get the foundation in. Most people had plastic or metal ends. There's a metal on the right, and the others are plastic. They were the invention of the devil, I think, because with most extractors, you had to take them off, and of course it was time consuming, and the metal ends were a good way of removing your fingers. Then of course people turned over to Hoffmans, and some of us, and I'll say some of us, use castellations. I use castellations throughout, including the brood box, and I have done for the best part of 60 years. Plastics, of course, have come in, and this is a really good example. These little feeders, I think they're really good feeders for amateurs. But queen cages used to be made out of wire and wood. Now all plastic. Oh, you still get wire and wood ones as well. Queen excluders, plastic, and a lot of plastics used in beekeeping. Open mesh floors came in for monitoring Varroa, but as I think I've already said, a lot of people are moving away from them now because there aren't the benefits that we were told. Other changes, there's less interest in showing. Certainly when I was started keeping bees, a lot of people like showing their honey, and that interest has gone off. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm just telling you what's happened. We've now got a lot more weekend beekeepers, where beekeepers used to come home, and if a colony of bees had swarmed, let's say, on a Tuesday afternoon, they could generally deal with it. But of course now with people working away, all sorts of things like that, the weekend beekeeper has become much more of a norm. We of course had the rise of what one might term less conventional beekeeping. So people that we use top bar hives, worries, other types of hives. Natural beekeeping has come in, and as I hinted earlier, there's less interest in the honey, more in the bees, the pollination and what the bees do than they used to be. Of course, polyhives have come in, especially polynukes. More gadgets, as I mentioned. In 2006, that's 18 years ago, small hive beetle and tropicalaps, which Dan spoke about earlier, were added to the notifiable pest list. Hopefully we still haven't got them, but they were considered so dangerous and so much of a threat 18 years ago that the government included them in the notifiable list. Queen problems. I was probably the first person to, if not notice them, to write about them around about the turn of the century. This is really three problems with young queens. Young queens failing soon after starting laying, being superseded soon after laying, starting to lay, rather than superseding after anywhere between 3 and 5 years, and queens simply disappearing. I don't want to talk about that too much here, but I first noticed it about the turn of the century. I know it is actually universal because I've spoken to beekeepers in other countries and I've actually seen evidence in other countries as well. I have got a page on it on Dave Cushion's website. If you haven't heard or you don't know, haven't read about it, please have a look. One thing that hasn't changed, that is beekeeping politics. Now, beekeeping politics are usually caused by people, and I think that's an appropriate place for me to end.
Have you ever, the BBKA, tried to do about the education for the primary schools? Make the children aware of Asian hornet.
Right, make children aware. Well, I think if you make the general public aware, then you should be getting it down to children. Actually, I find doing shows, children probably know far more about bees and insects than the parents do. So I think they're probably soaking up the information. I think there's a little bit of an issue with Asian hornets because how much publicity do you give it? If you keep giving it, pumping out publicity, eventually nobody will take any notice of it. But if you drip feed it every so often, then I think it will have much more of an effect. That's only a personal view.
Have you ever bought a brand new hive?
Have I?
Yes.
No, but what I've bought is bits.
Yeah, okay with that.
Yeah. What shall I say? Sometimes they haven't been seconds; they've been thirds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now thirds sometimes need a bit of bits cut out. What I have got is a hive that I've designed, which is effectively a national, but an 8-frame national rather than 11-frame national. And all I've done is cut 114 millimetres off it, so it's 114 millimetres narrower. That, I think, will help people who struggle with lifting. Now, with those, yes, I did buy new brood chambers and supers, and then I cut them down. But I haven't bought a new hive as such. Everything has been second-hand. Since at least the mid-1980s, I've been the auctioneer at the West Sussex auction, or the main auctioneer. Now it's shared with other people. And it's surprising sometimes what people bring in, and it just needs a bit of repair, and others don't want it. So I've ended up with it for, £1 or $2. That's where I've got a lot of my stuff from. So no, I've never bought a new hive as such.
Yeah. You're a man after my own heart. Second question, what do you think about Manly super frames?
Manly frames?
Manly super frames, yes.
What do I think about? Yeah, I've never used them. I've seen other people use them, and I've seen other people with them very heavily propolised, but I've never used them. Yeah. In fact, Manly frames, I think, were not Manly's idea. There was a man called Teddy Maddock from Norfolk. They were his idea. Manly saw them and just started using them, and they ended up being being called Manly frames when they weren't. It was somebody else's idea, but that.
Okay, thank you very much.
I haven't used. What I have seen is people to get them out of the super, put a block of wood inside, and then push the super down so the whole lot comes up, and then they peel them off like sliced bread.
I wasn't going to talk about thirds. All I'll comment is when my wife bought a third super home, I found I was trying to fit a beveled side going one way to a beveled side going the other way. I should have brought it down to you, shouldn't I? I was one of those urban persons who came in 20 years ago without any background in beekeeping, and as soon as I got down to the branch, they said, "What do you do for a job?" I said, "I was a teacher." The next thing I know, I'm there out front. I know bugger all about beekeeping, but there I am out front. One thing I think has changed is there has been support to learn how to teach through the BBKA. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts about that, but I think they've done quite a good job.
I clearly can't do much in an hour, can I? Thanks, Bob.